I noticed the smell before I noticed the color. It was faint, subtle, like someone had opened a can of paint somewhere far down the hallway. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. Maybe maintenance was touching up another unit. Our building is old. They repaint doors every few years. I didn't think much of it until I stepped out to grab a package. The smell got stronger. Not overwhelming. Just fresh. New. I looked at my door. Something felt different, but I couldn't immediately say what. It was still brown. Still matte, still scratched in the same places near the handle, but the tone was slightly deeper. Warmer. Less faded. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I did something strange. I touched it. The surface felt smooth. Too smooth. My door has always had a slightly rough texture. Tiny chips. Layers of old paint. Now it felt even. Fresh. I pressed my thumb harder. It didn't leave a mark. It wasn't wet, but it felt new. I stepped back into my apartment. I had been home all day. I work remotely. My desk is 10 feet from the door. If someone had sanded it, primed it, painted it, I would have heard something, even the faint scrape of a brush. But I hadn't. No knocking. No notice. No maintenance slip under the door. I checked the hinges. They had tiny flecks of brown near the screws. Fresh flecks, like overspray or brush flick. My heart rate shifted slightly. Not panic. Just confusion. Maybe they painted it weeks ago and I never noticed. But that didn't make sense. The smell was new. I went downstairs to the lobby. The other doors on my floor were the same faded tone they've always been, slightly desaturated. Mine looked newer. Not dramatically. Just subtly. Enough that if you stood back and compared, you'd see it. I asked the front desk attendant, "Hey, were doors repainted recently?" He looked at me like the question was random. "No, not this month." "What about just mine?" He frowned. "We don't do single doors." I went back upstairs. Stood in front of it again. The peephole had a faint ring of cleaner metal around it, like it had been removed and reinstalled. I know that peephole. There's a tiny scratch under it from when I moved in. It was gone. Or maybe covered. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Closed it behind me. Then opened it again. The inner side of the door looked exactly the same. Slightly chipped near the bottom, but the hallway-facing side felt restored. Refinished. Repaired. And I had been home. All day. At 3:17 p.m. I made coffee. At 4:02 p.m. I took out trash. At 4:07 p.m. I walked back in. The door looked normal then. I would have noticed a fresh paint smell. I'm sensitive to it. At 6:11 p.m. I stepped out for the package. That's when I smelled it, which meant if it had been painted, it happened between 4:07 and 6:11. While I was inside. In silence. No knock. No notice. No sound. I placed a small piece of transparent tape on the top corner of the door before going to bed. Not visible from eye level. Just a test. If someone touched it, the tape would wrinkle. The next morning, the tape was gone. Not fallen. Removed. Cleanly. And the surface where it had been placed looked slightly more even than the rest. As if that exact area had been lightly sanded again. That's when it stopped being confusion. And started being something else. Because repainting a door while someone is home isn't maintenance. It's access. The tape was gone. That was the first thing I checked when I opened the door the next morning. I stood on my toes, looked at the top right corner where I had pressed it flat the night before. Nothing. No edge. No residue. No curled plastic hanging loose. Just smooth paint. Smoother than the rest. Like that section had been lightly sanded and retouched. I ran my fingers across the surface. The texture changed halfway across the door. The upper right quadrant felt newer than the lower left. As if the job had been corrected overnight. I hadn't left. I hadn't slept deeply. No drilling. No scraping. No hallway noise. I live alone. I'm a light sleeper. If someone even tests the handle at night, I hear it. But this felt deliberate, precise, measured. I stepped back and looked at the entire frame. That's when I saw it. The door frame itself was slightly darker. Not obviously just enough that if you compared it to the baseboard nearby, you'd notice the tone mismatch. The frame had always been chipped near the bottom left corner. A small crescent-shaped crack in the paint. It was gone. Not repaired poorly. Not filled. Gone. Like that section had been replaced. I crouched down and ran my finger along the bottom edge. There was a thin line of fine dust between the threshold and the floor. Fresh. Not construction dust. More like sanding residue. But I vacuumed weakly. There hadn't been dust there yesterday. I went inside and checked the inside edge of the frame. Still old paint. Still chipped. Which meant only the hallway facing surfaces had changed. Only what the building could see. I tested the door. Closed it slowly. Listened. The sound was different. Subtly. The latch used to click with a sharp metallic snap. Now it was softer. Muted. Like the strike plate had been slightly adjusted. I opened it again and looked closely at the metal plate in the frame. The screws were newer. Not brand new, but cleaner. Less oxidized than before. And one of them had a faint scratch on the head, like it had been recently tightened. My stomach tightened a little. Replacing a strike plate requires removing the door, or at least opening it fully. You can't do that silently. You can't sand and repaint a door in a hallway without smell. Without noise. Unless it wasn't done in one session. Unless it was done gradually. Tiny adjustments. Minutes at a time. I tried to reconstruct the day before. At 5:23 p.m., I had headphones on during a meeting. At 5:47 p.m., I went to the bathroom. At 6:02 p.m., I was in the kitchen. There were windows of 3 to 5 minutes when I wasn't directly near the door. But still, painting dries. Slowly. Sanding makes noise. I decided to test something else. I measured the distance between the door edge and the wall. Top hinge side 0.3 millimeters. Bottom hinge side 0.4 millimeters. I'm not obsessive, but I know that gap was even before. I remember because when I moved in, the door used to stick slightly in humid weather. Now it closed smoothly. Too smoothly. Like it had been rehung. That night, I placed something heavier than tape. I wedged a thin strip of paper into the hinge seam. Barely visible. If the hinge pin moved, the paper would tear. Then I placed a tiny pencil mark on the frame, just under the top hinge. Small enough to look accidental. Then I waited. The next morning, the pencil mark was still there, but lighter, like someone had wiped over it with a damp cloth. The paper strip? Gone. Not torn. Removed. And the hinge pin sat slightly higher than before. Less than a millimeter, but visible if you stare long enough. I stared long enough. I knocked on my neighbor's door casually that afternoon. Hey, random question. Has anyone been doing hallway maintenance? She shook her head. Not that I've noticed. Any painting? No. Why? I didn't answer. I went back inside and shut my door slowly. This time, I pressed my ear against it. It felt thicker. I can't explain that. The sound of the hallway seemed more muted than usual. Like an extra layer of paint had sealed the edges tighter. Or like something inside the door had changed. I stepped back and looked at the peephole again. The tiny scratch under it was definitely gone. Completely. Not filled. Not visible. Erased. And that's when the thought hit me. What if they didn't repaint my door? What if they replaced it? Not the whole thing. Just the outer panel. Or the skin. Just the visible surface. Quietly. Incrementally. While I was inside. And if that's true, then they didn't need to open it fully. They just needed access to the hinges. And access to the hinges means at some point the door had to move. And if it moved even slightly, then someone was standing in my doorway while I was home. After the hinge pin moved, I stopped thinking in terms of paint. Paint doesn't adjust alignment. Paint doesn't erase scratches cleanly. Paint doesn't shift weight. But something had shifted. I noticed it that afternoon when I opened the door to take out the trash. It felt heavier. Dramatically. Just enough resistance in the first few inches of movement. Like the balance point had changed. Doors have a natural swing weight. You get used to it without realizing. This one now required a fraction more effort to pull. And when I let go, it didn't stay where I left it. It drifted. Slowly. Closing itself. Not slamming. Not dramatic. Just easing inward like it preferred to be shut. Before, it would stay half open without moving. Now it sought the frame. I checked the hinges again. The top hinge pin sat slightly higher than before. Less than before. Actually, like it had been tapped back down. Calibrated. The screws were still cleaner than the others. I crouched and examined the bottom hinge. There was a thin hairline scratch in the paint. Beside it. Vertical. Fresh. The kind of mark you get when a screwdriver slips. I hadn't done that. I haven't touched those hinges since I moved in. I ran my hand along the outer surface again. It wasn't just smooth. It was uniform. Too uniform. Old apartment doors have uneven brushstrokes, slight layering, tiny bubbles. This surface looked factory consistent, which made the scratches near the handle even stranger. They were still there, but softened. Less sharp. As if lightly sanded and resealed. I grabbed a flashlight and angled it across the surface. Raking light reveals everything. Tiny waves in the paint, subtle variations in texture. I expected to see patchwork. Instead, I saw a faint rectangular outline. About 1 inch from the door's edge. A subtle border. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Like a panel had been set into the existing door. I stepped back, then leaned closer. Again. Yes. There was a seam. Very faint, running vertically near the lock side. Perfectly straight. Too straight for old wood. My throat tightened. Replacing the outer skin of a door doesn't require removing the entire frame. You can detach it from the hinges, lay it flat, work on it. Then rehang. But to do that, you have to open it. You have to move it. And if you move it while someone's inside, they would notice. Unless it wasn't done all at once. Unless it was done in pieces. The next morning, I did something deliberate. I placed a thin strip of masking tape across the seam. Pressed flat. Then I closed the door and left for groceries. When I returned, the tape was intact. Untouched. I felt a strange relief. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the seam had always been there. Maybe I'd never looked closely enough. That night, around 8:40 p.m., I heard something. Not loud. Just a soft, internal shift, like wood settling. I looked toward the door. It was closed. Still. I walked closer. The handle looked slightly lower. Not visibly. Just subtly misaligned with the trim line on the wall. I crouched and measured with my finger against the frame. The gap at the top was now slightly wider than at the bottom. Earlier it had been the opposite. The door had been adjusted again. While I was inside, I went to the peephole, pressed my eye against it. The hallway looked the same, but the perspective felt slightly different. Lower, like my eye level through the lens had shifted down a fraction. That shouldn't happen unless the lens had been reinstalled, or the door itself had been repositioned vertically. I pulled back and stared at the peephole ring. There was the faintest micro-scratch around its edge. Circular, like it had been unscrewed, and tightened again. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even thought about it until 2 days ago. The next morning, I tested something else. I locked the door. Then pushed gently from inside. Before, it had felt solid. Now, there was a tiny amount of flex, barely perceptible, like the outer layer was thinner, or newer. That's when the idea stopped being abstract. If the outer skin was replaced, what was behind it? Old doors have hollow cores, cardboard grid inside. Lightweight. If someone replaced the outer panel, they could insert something .reinforcement .insulation or remove something. Because repainting explains color, but it doesn't explain recalibration, it doesn't explain weight shift, it doesn't explain the erased scratch under the peephole. And it doesn't explain why. Last night, when I stood quietly in the living room, I heard the faintest pressure change near the door, like air adjusting, as if the seal had been tested from the other side. Without knocking, without opening, just pressure. Testing alignment, testing resistance, and tonight, when I let go of the handle after closing it, it didn't drift shut slowly, it clicked, decisively, as if pulled from the hallway side. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because of noise. Because of silence. The hallway outside my apartment is never completely quiet. There's always something. Elevator hum, distant footsteps, plumbing, but that morning it felt insulated, muted. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing, no faint air movement. No echo from the corridor. Just dull pressure, like the door had been padded. I opened it slowly. The hallway sounded normal again. Subtle mechanical noise from somewhere down the corridor. But when I closed it, silence returned. Too much silence. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the inner edge of the frame. That's when I felt it. A rubber seal. There had always been a thin strip of weather stripping, old. Cracked, this was new, soft, dense, and it ran evenly along the entire perimeter. I pressed it, it bounced back. New seals don't install themselves, and they don't appear without the door being fully removed. You can't thread a continuous gasket through the hinge side without detaching the door, which meant, at some point, it had been off the hinges. Even if only briefly. I checked the hinge screws again. All 3 hinges now had the same clean metallic sheen. Before, only the top one did. The bottom hinge screw had a tiny shaving of wood at its edge. Fresh, light colored. It hadn't oxidized yet. Someone had taken it out recently. I tested the door again. Turned the handle. Pulled. It didn't move. Locked. Pulled again. Resistance. Much, but enough to feel unnatural, like suction. I pulled harder. It opened with a soft release sound. Air pressure shifting. That wasn't normal. Doors don't seal that tightly in old buildings. They warp. They leak air. This one was airtight. That night, I stood in the hallway and looked at my door from a distance. It looked perfect. Even. Symmetrical. Almost too symmetrical compared to the others. The color matched exactly now. Not slightly. Darker. Not warmer. Exactly uniform. As if standardized. I glanced at the neighboring doors. They were faded. Uneven. Slightly chipped. Mine looked like it had been replaced yesterday. And that's when I saw something else. A faint line across the middle. Horizontal. Not a scratch. Not damage. A seam. Barely visible. Like 2 panels. Joined together. I stepped closer. Ran my fingernail across it. I could feel the transition. Very slight, but real, which meant this wasn't just a refinished surface. It was a composite layer. A shell. And if there was a shell, there was something between it and the original core. The next morning, I tried something simple. I left my apartment and locked the door. Then I waited in the hallway, around the corner. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Then, very faintly, a metallic click. Not from the lock. From the hinge side. I stepped back toward the door quietly. The door looked the same, but the handle had shifted slightly upward. Almost imperceptible. I unlocked it and pushed. It didn't open. Not immediately. It felt stuck. Like something inside was holding it. I pushed harder. Then suddenly it released. The new seal separating from the frame with a soft peel sound. Inside, everything looked normal. but the air felt still heavy like it had been contained. I checked the threshold. There were faint scuff marks along the floor directly under the door. Parallel lines as if the door had been removed and rested there at some point then reinstalled. But I never left long enough for that to happen, and I worked 10 feet from the door. Unless it wasn't removed during the day. Unless it was removed in increments. Hinge by hinge panel by panel. Layer by layer and each time I was in another room. Headphones on water running music playing. Small windows of distraction. That night, I did something different. I placed a chair directly against the door, wedged tight so it couldn't move even a centimeter. Then I went to bed at around 2:30 a.m. I heard it. Not a knock not a push. Just pressure. A subtle, steady pressure from the other side. The chair creaked slightly, then stopped no further sound. I stayed awake until morning when I moved the chair away and opened the door. There were no marks no damage. No forced entry. Just the hallway silent but when I looked down at the threshold, the fine sanding dust was back fresh and perfectly aligned along the seam. On day 12, I measured the thickness. I hadn't done that before. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want proof. I opened the door and placed a ruler against the edge. 4 centimeters. That's standard at least. That's what I remembered. I went downstairs, looked at the door of the vacant unit across the lobby 3.5 centimeters. I checked 2 more. All 3 and a half. Mine was thicker, not by much, but enough that it couldn't be imagination. I went back upstairs, slowly stood in front of it, ran my hand along the edge. The seam I'd felt before was clearer now. The outer skin had depth like a laminated layer. The inner surface still looked old, chipped, near the bottom. But the hallway-facing side was not the same door. That afternoon, I knocked on maintenance. Casual tone. Hey, quick question. Has my door ever been replaced? The guy checked a tablet. No work orders on your unit. Ever? He scrolled. Original installation. Original. That word stayed with me. Original. Because mine wasn't original anymore. That night, I did something I should have done earlier. I removed the hinge pins. All 3. It wasn't easy. They were tighter than they should have been. As if recently set. I lifted the door carefully off the frame. Set it flat on the living room floor. It felt heavier than it should. Not dramatically. Just wrong. I examined the hallway-facing side. From this angle, the seam was undeniable. A thin outline of a secondary panel adhered perfectly over the original surface. I pressed along the edges. It didn't flex. It was bonded. I moved to the peephole, unscrewed it. The outer lens detached easily. Too easily. Behind it, there was an extra cavity. A shallow, rectangular recess between the new outer panel and the old core. Empty. But clean. Purpose built. The edges were machine cut. Not improvised. This wasn't paint. It wasn't cosmetic. It was structural modification. Someone had added a second skin to my door from the outside without removing the interior face, which means they never needed to enter. They only needed to open it slightly, detach it, work in the hallway, rehang it. All while I was inside. And because the new seal muted sound and the hinge adjustments were incremental, I never heard the full removal. Just small corrections, small calibrations, the sanding dust, the new screws, the erased, scratched the seal, the weight shift. It wasn't done in one day. It was done over several, layer by layer, when I wasn't looking directly at it, when I had headphones on, when I was in the shower. When I stepped into the kitchen. Tiny windows. Enough that I flipped the door over. The inner side looked untouched. Old paint, old chips. Original. They hadn't changed what I could see from inside. Only what the hallway could see. Only what they could access. Only the outer surface. I stood the door back upright, reattached it, locked it, and sat down on the couch. 10 feet away. The same place I'd been every day while it happened. I tried to imagine the timing. Someone loosening hinge screws, holding the door steady, working silently while I answered emails, while I made coffee, while I sat 10 feet away. I would have heard it, unless they waited for predictable noise, elevator arrival, neighbor's vacuum, plumbing rush, moments when the building masked sound. And then I remembered something small. 3 days ago, at 4:02 p.m., I'd flushed the toilet. There was a loud pipe surge. About 15 seconds long. I remember thinking the plumbing sounded unusually strong that day. 15 seconds is enough to lift a hinge pin. 15 seconds is enough to reseat a door slightly. 15 seconds is enough to adjust alignment, layer by layer. Moment by moment. Not repainting. Not replacing the entire door. Just upgrading it while I was home. Now the door closes perfectly. Seals tight. Feels heavier. Looks newer. And from the hallway, it matches the building's renovation aesthetic exactly. Uniform. Updated. Optimized. The other doors still look old. Mine looks standardized. And I never signed a notice. Never received a work order. Never opened the door for maintenance. But the door isn't the one I moved in with. Not on the outside, only on the inside. And I still sit 10 feet from it every day. Listening. Waiting. Because if they could replace the outer skin without me noticing, there's no reason they couldn't replace the inner one next.